Hi, my name is Brian Deck, and I'm here at Chicago's Narwhal Recording Studios today to talk to you about different ways of processing snare drum with plugins. This first example is a song called How Many Times from the last Alejandro Escovedo record that I worked on about 3 years ago. The situation at the time when we recorded it was we were working at a rural studio in the middle of Italy, and we had very limited resources. The EQ on the console was very scratchy and we couldn't really use it, and so we got a very dry, kind of flat recording of the snare drum. Here's how it sounds when it's all mixed. Here's how it sounds with just the snare drum soloed up, and I'm going to turn off the plugins that I had on it. And turn off the drum bus plugins. Very flat and unexciting. So the first thing that I did, bussing the top and bottom snares together, was bring a little brightness, scoop a little mid-range, and bring a fair amount of bottom end into it. I used the Neve 1073 UAD plugin to do that. That sounds a lot brighter and a lot beefier. Another trick that I do quite often is add a little distortion to that, and I used the, once again, the UAD Thermionic Culture Vulture distortion plugin. I have the mix dialed back to about 60% and a fair amount of drive on it. That punches it up considerably. Again, we're listening to just the snare mics right now. And I'm going to turn the bus processing on. All the drum mics together are going through a bus that I'm compressing with the 1176 plugin and brightening with the Pultec EQP1A UAD plugin. And here's the full drum kit. Another aspect of this recording was that everyone played live in the same room. You can hear that when I solo up the drum mics. You can hear that keyboard playing because it's bleeding. Everything's bleeding. The bass is bleeding less because it was downstairs in an old barn. But what that meant was we couldn't have any ambient mics out for the drums to add a sense of space to what was going on. They were all close mics. So going back to listening to just the snare mics, I added a little bit of this Ocean Way Studios room simulator plugin, which is modeled on Bill Putnam's original Ocean Way Studios. It's a very, very realistic room sound that you get on the snare drum. Here it is without. And it's just subtly mixed in, but it gives a sense of space, and it gives even more bottom end. And that's how I think we ended up with a fairly exciting drum sound on what I have to admit was not my best recording of drums ever. Okay, the second example I have for snare processing with plugins is a song called Funny from Chicago rap group Big Branch. We recorded this entirely in my basement, and the chorus has live drums on it. The verses and most of the rest of the song have electronic drums, mostly 808s. And so I needed an acoustic kit that sounded competitive with the power of the 808s and the bigness of the 808s. but we had less than ideal circumstances being in my basement with just 2 microphones. So here's what those drums sound like coming in on the chorus.
I've been had, but you said the funniest thing I've heard tonight. Oh, you said the funniest thing I've heard tonight.
Pretty powerful, pretty cool. They didn't start out that way. So here's the snare drum soloed up with all the plugins bypassed. That's a Shure SM57 placed between the hi-hat and the snare drum to try to pick up both of them. And it just sounds like someone's tapping lightly. It doesn't sound powerful. So the first thing I did was grab the SSL E-channel UAD plugin, and I did a mid-range scoop with that. Next thing I did was I wanted a little bit of crunch on that, and I grabbed the UAD SPL twin tube processor, and I'm using more saturation than I am harmonic enhancement because I didn't want it to get too bright. And here's what that sounds like. So again, I'm doing a kind of a lot of bus processing on these drums. I'm going to put the kick channels in, and we'll bring the bus processing in one at a time. The first thing in that signal chain is the TubeTech CL1B compressor, which we have those in the rack here at the studio, but we weren't at the studio, we were at my house. So this is a really great sounding plug-in. Sounds very close to the original, and I believe we're going mildly with this. Yeah, it's a bright tube compressor, and I'm barely showing 1 dB of gain reduction. We're getting quite a bit more gain reduction in the UAD 1176 limiting amplifier plug-in. There's a characteristic sound of the original hardware units due to the distinctive input transformer and line amps inside. It sounds great on drums. I've always loved it, and this does a really good job of modeling that sound. We're going for a lot more character and a lot more gain reduction with this one. It sounds like this. Starting to sound like itself now, like it does in the track. I'm using the Pultec EQP1A plug-in to get a little more body to the kick drum and really take it all the way toward being competitive with the 808s. You can hear it's subtle, but it's bigger. And the final thing that I did was I employed the UAD model of the classic Neve line amp, the 1272, which is found throughout the 80 series consoles from the 1970s, as well as their production consoles from the time, the Melbourne and such like. So I've got the output turned down and the input turned up, and that's going to give a little bit of extra crunch and glue and pull this whole thing together and make it sound tough. You can hear like a flutter of air on the kick drum now, and that really sits in the mix nicely.
Tonight. Oh, you said the funniest thing I've heard tonight. And the way you said it.
On to the next example. One last piece about the production of drums and snare drums specifically on Funny by Big Branch is toward the end of the song, in the last 2 choruses, we wanted to amp things up. We wanted to get bigger, we wanted to get more impactful. And so we decided we already have the live kit that I played for you before, and the 808s are back in, so it's live kit and 808s together. And then we double and triple the live kit with a new live kit. We picked a different kick drum, we picked a different snare drum, different hi-hats. We moved it all upstairs into my living room instead of in my basement, and we doubled the drums and then we tripled the drums on mono track each, split them hard left and right. And I'm going to play for you what those drum tracks sound like on their own. Interesting, kind of small, roomy. It was an 18-inch kick drum, so the intent wasn't to have huge drums come in, but to have a new texture come in that would layer with what's already there. And those drums are just getting a little bit of 1176 compression. Well, more than a little bit. That's kind of a lot of gain reduction. And that's bringing out the roominess of it, the sound of my living room. So here's what it sounds like when those come in and join the other kit on the final two choruses.
This thing I heard tonight. You said the funniest thing I heard tonight. You said the funniest thing I heard tonight. And the way you said it, I said.
It's cool. You get a sense of stereo because they come in split left and right. They're not exactly synced. They're not quantized. There's press rolls on at different times on each of the sides, and it's just a really cool extra texture to have happen at the end, and really does make that snare pop. This third example of how to process snare drum with plugins comes from a song called Vinegar by Chicago band Wreath of Hogs. It's a big guitar, kind of indie rock band, quintessential, almost 90s kind of sound. And it was recorded very, very well. I mixed this. I did not record it. It was recorded in the Audio Tree Studios here in Chicago. Well, first let me play for you what the kit sounds like in context going into the first chorus, which gets very big.
She wanna kiss me. I can feel the room watching. It's like I've never been kissed before. I don't wanna dream.
So big guitars, that snare punches right through. It's really great sounding, wasn't hard to work with in any way. I will play for you what it sounded like, just the raw track with no processing. That's the top snare, here's the bottom snare. Okay, so starting with the top snare, I reached for the UAD API Vision channel strip to give a slight boost to the top end, little mid-range cut, and 4 dB at 200 for the bottom. This is what that sounds like. A little more focused, a little more full. And here's the bottom snare mic. I always cut a boxy frequency that usually lives somewhere around 700 to 1200 cycles in the bottom snare with a narrow cut. Here I've used the Neve 31102 EQ plugin, high Q at 700, ducked. I don't know how many dB that is, but it's a good bit. And here's what that sounds like. Bypass. Papery and boxy. All right, and those are going through their own bus, and I'm bus processing them together with the Culture Vulture distortion plugin by UAD. You all know by now that I like a little distortion on as many things as I can get it on. It brings a nice, snappy, crisp, high-end character that you're not going to be able to access with just EQ. It takes a little bit of saturation to make that happen, and this is what it sounds like. As well as gluing the two mics together. And then I have all of the drums going through a stereo bus, and I'll show you the effect that the processors in that bus have on it. The first thing I've got here is the Neve 1272 model. Output turned down a little bit, input turned up a little bit. It's just a little bit of crunch, not a lot. A little bit of top and bottom from the Pultec EQP1A. A fair amount of rock and roll kind of compression on the drum bus. Although I've got the mix dialed back to about 60%, it's getting about 3, maybe 4 dB of gain reduction at times. And then a little finishing touch with the TubeTech CL1B, which is a nice bright, almost glossy kind of tube compressor that we have in the rack here, but I was doing this mix in the box. So here's what that brings to it.
I can feel the room watching. It's like I've never been kissed before. I don't wanna.
So those are a number of things that I do to help the snare drum attain the character that I'm looking for within the context of the music and cut through and do its job. I do processing on individual tracks. I do processing on a bus track for the multiple snare mics, sometimes together. And then almost always there's an amount of drum bus processing on top of that. I hope that that's helpful for you. This is by no means the only way to go about it. I encourage you to experiment and move further from there. So thanks for looking and listening, and good luck with your mixes.
It's like I've never